In a world where even the smallest disagreements can lead to arguments, violence, and even death, two brothers tackle the difficult subjects. This podcast is not just about dissecting topics from two different perspectives. It's also about how to have conversations on difficult topics while avoiding the urge to tear someone's head off and vomit down the bloody stump of their neck. Today, we're going to discuss whether there is bias in social media against conservative voices. Yeah?
Agreed.
All right, let's do it. So this is a common belief, and it's going to be I'm very curious to see how the conversation goes, because what I found is not only is there no evidence to support that, there's actually evidence to move it in the other direction. That there's been a lot of compensation towards the right wing in an effort to avoid the appearance of bias against some of the conservative voices. I'm curious if you found anything different.
Well, I did look at, there's that one, I did find some different things, and it's a difficult thing because I think a lot of um, what you find in the research, I don't think anybody's been able to actually go to the social media platforms and do some real studies on um, what their actually to figure out how many stories get suppressed, how many stories get taken down, and how many don't. And even if you did, it would be somewhat difficult because, just to give an example, let's say, for example, if I were the one that had sole control and I had the time and the capability to control Twitter or Facebook or both of them, you know, I would guess that if I were in charge or if I were the one doing it, I would identify certain stories that were fake news, shall we say, or that should be taken down that would be different than those that you would. Now, sure, we'd find some hate speech or some fake news stories that we would agree upon, but there would certainly be times where I would say, hey, this one's fake news, and you'd say, no, it's not, and vice versa. You would say it's fake news, and I'd say, no, 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 there's some evidence for that. I mean, one example of that, I just find it interesting that as I was looking about, I go down some rabbit holes when I do the research for some of these stories, or for some of these talks that you and I have. But the rabbit hole that I was looking at was, Trump keeps getting accused of, he is always accusing people of stealing the election from him, that the election was stolen. And when you read the news stories, now it's not social media, but when you read the news stories, they almost always say Trump claimed without evidence that the election had been stolen from him. Baseless claims.
Mm-hmm.
I think is a very strong thing to say. You might say, well, the election wasn't stolen from him, but to say that there's no evidence is pretty strong. And the reason I say that, like, let's say, for example, they brought evidence again, in a trial, let's say against O.J. Simpson, and they don't convict him of murder. Well, there's still evidence that he did it. It may not be strong evidence, it may not be conclusive evidence, but there's still evidence. And I think there's plenty of people that may have made the case that that there was improprieties and that the election was stolen from him. But when Hillary Clinton says that the election was stolen from her, nobody says anything about baseless or without any evidence. They just say that she claims that the election was stolen from her because they agree that maybe it was, or there were some improprieties, right? But it's just, when people look at the same story, they might see it very differently. And I think that's the problem that I have with this. I didn't see any studies in, that paper that you sent to me that I had found myself as well, that actually went through and did a comprehensive analysis of what happened. What they did was they said, well, we looked at it, we identified some fake news stories, and we think that they were mostly right wing, but it's them deciding that those are fake news stories. Am I making, I think that's the problem we have when somebody goes in and looks at these issues. They're going to look at it with their bias. And I would say that some of those stories weren't fake, and you would maybe agree that they were.
Yeah, and I think that baseless claims point that you make is an important one, because there's been an evolution in how they analyzed his statements. And after the election and for the next few months afterwards, there was, of course, a lot of court cases and a lot of investigations that were being done by states and some of their legislatures. And over and over and over again, there was shown that these claims of fraud were baseless. And the baseless claims.
They never said baseless, Brian. They never said
Hold
baseless.
on.
They just said that it wasn't, that they didn't agree with him. They didn't say baseless. Like, that's a strong word.
They said that the claims of fraud were baseless because there was no basis for the claims of fraud. And that was the whole point. There was more than 60 cases, 60 lawsuits that were filed, and every single one of those lawsuits were thrown out. And at that point, those are baseless claims. And so when the media is reporting baseless claims, it was not being reported in the very beginning that that was the case. That label of baseless claims was an evolution to the point where we now have absolutely no basis for the claims of fraud that Trump is making. You and I have talked about that there's been minor state cases, that there's been 2 or 3 in this state and 10 in this state where there was, some evidence that people had voted erroneously. But the wide scale, broad fraud that Trump is claiming is entirely baseless. But of course, we're moving a little bit beyond the what this conversation is supposed to be about, which is where does social media stand on some of this supposed conservative bias? And if we're to start off the conversation with a study that was done, let's see, Oxford Internet Institute did a bunch of stuff with some of the Twitter groups, and they found that extreme hard right pages circulated more junk news than all the other audience groups put together, meaning hard right, center left, hard left, that the hard right was circulating more junk news than anybody else. And so when you're talking about posts or articles that are being labeled as bad, junk, false, whatever it might be, more of those news sources or more of those sources are coming from the hard right. And so, of course, more hard right sources are going to get labeled as such. So that would explain, in part, why these pages, these right-wing commentators claim fraud or claim bias.
First of all, to go back to what you said, to say there was not that evolution you were talking about. From the beginning, people were calling it baseless and saying there was no evidence of it. What's more is, it wasn't like they said it was baseless. They just said there wasn't enough evidence to rule in his favor. But I agree, we don't want to. That's not baseless, Brian. That's like saying it was baseless to bring evidence against O.J. Simpson, or any time a court case is lost, that it was completely baseless. No, it isn't. They didn't have enough evidence to prove their case. It doesn't. All it says is, I mean, many times court cases are won just because of improprieties in the way the evidence was brought. It doesn't mean it's baseless or there was no evidence. There was evidence. It was just very small, and it probably didn't happen.
Basically inconsequential.
Okay, but that's not baseless. And it's not without evidence. And those are 2 key things that people are saying. But nobody says that about Hillary Clinton in these news stories, but they do say it every time about Donald Trump.
And the reason why,
Fox News. Unless we're talking about Fox News, then they won't call it baseless, right?
The reason why is Hillary Clinton conceded. Trump never did. Still hasn't.
What does that have to do with whether or not it was baseless or not?
Because he is still putting forth the argument that he won the election. She is not putting forth the argument that she won the election. She has conceded the election.
She conceded the election, but she called him an illegitimate president and said the election was stolen from her.
She said that there was influence from the Russians. Look, okay, we're moving way beyond the topic that we had intended to talk about. And I think that we have covered this before, and I'm happy to cover it again. But I think we really need to focus on the social media supposed bias on the conservative base.
Okay, Brian, but I guess this is the point that I'm making. You and I see this differently. Like, I have a news story up right now where she says he was an illegitimate president. So you I don't know. I think it's important too. Well, okay, we can just move past it, but I think it's important when people get wrapped up in the emotions of this stuff. They're looking for any reason to any way to make their point. We all are,
Sure.
and we'll get into that, I guess. But anyway, what I would say about this is, you know, if there's one study that says, for example, that all of these people that more of the stories come from the far right, those are judgment calls. It's very difficult to say. I'm sure you could find studies that say the opposite. When we look
Have
at,
you found any?
yeah, I have. Let me just see if I could pull one of them up here. Hopefully, I can pull it up. I can't find it, Brian.
If you do find it, I'm happy to share it and post it post this conversation. And the reason why I ask, because in my research, I was not able to find anything that looked at, that found the influence leaning the other way. All the evidence that I found, and I found a few different reports, few different papers that were commenting on the fact that anytime you found either fake news or another one that looked at what they called hate bait sources, almost, let's see, the list was entirely made up of right-leaning organizations led by Breitbart, Fox News, and the Daily Caller. I also did find that in 2019, Facebook had an internal audit, and they asked a former senator, a conservative, John Kyle from Arizona, to lead the investigation. And what he found was that while Facebook's policies and their applications have the potential to restrict free expression, he added that there is still significant work to be done to satisfy the concerns we hear from conservatives, but he did not point to any evidence of actual bias. And so this was one that was led by a conservative, by a former senator from Arizona, and didn't find any evidence of
Brian,
bias.
so that report that you were talking about, it said some interesting things. So if we look at page 6, and I in the one that I posted, I posted a little bit late, so I don't know if you got a chance to look at it, but on page 6, under 2016 Silicon Valley politics, it talks about a Gizmodo report that in May 2016, just as the presidential campaign was heating up, that according to 2 anonymous former Facebook contract employees, the trending topics team had routinely removed articles from right-wing sources. Other employees denied this account. Well, then they did an internal, I mean, it was resolved, I'll grant you that, but they did an internal investigation determining that while it couldn't rule out the possibility of isolated improper actions or unintentional bias, there hadn't been any concerted effort to curb the conservative viewpoints, but there was evidence that they had done it.
Sure.
And then you read further on that page that at Facebook, 92% of individual political action committee and soft money contributions to federal candidates and parties in the 2020 election cycle went to Democrats. 92% of the Facebook employees, and at Google the number is 96%.
Okay.
At Twitter, 97%. I mean, these places are left-leaning places.
Sure.
And when and then you say, well, this was a study that tells, for example, that that there isn't right-wing bias. But a lot of the information or a lot of the methodology that they use, it just doesn't hold water for me. They're saying things that, well, listen, if there is a left-wing bias, how is it that Donald Trump led the pack among U.S. elected officials in Facebook interactions? And so they show like, okay, Donald Trump had 650 million interactions. The next biggest was Bernie Sanders at 33.
Right.
That to me does not prove anything. It proves that he's really good at social media. He's really good at riling people up. Then they said, some of the arguments it just didn't hold water with me. I didn't see evidence of the fact that they'd really gone into the number of stories that were silenced and said, well, they're more left or they're more right-leaning or anything like that. They just kind of did things like they say Fox News and Breitbart outdistance mainstream media, which, by the way, That's an interesting point, right? Because they say Fox News and Breitbart outdistance the mainstream media. They don't even consider Fox News the mainstream media.
No.
Was that just a misstatement, or do they really say that they're not the mainstream media?
Well, I mean, you have to agree, and I'm not saying I agree with that statement, but you have to agree that their philosophy is a little bit different than, let's say, CNN and MSNBC, which are probably the two other large cable media sources. So I guess they're calling anything left of center mainstream, and I don't agree with it, but I guess they're creating their own a category that way.
Okay, so yeah, it seems odd to me that they would do that because Fox News is mainstream media. Uh,
Well, okay, so let's go back to what you were saying a few minutes ago that the majority of the employees at Facebook and at Google, and I'm not sure what Google is not really social media, but the majority of them are left leaning, are liberal, and yet we have the largest, I guess, page of or interactions are happening through Trump's Facebook page. So it does sort of bring into question if everybody is so hard left and the number one site for or the number one source for interactions is Donald Trump, then it does make one question: is the left within the company putting their thumb on the scale?
Great question. I'm glad that you brought that up.
All right.
So, what's interesting is it feels to me that this is one example of how they're cherry picking the data. Because I would say two things about that. One, Donald Trump had all those interactions, which was more than Senator Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, all those guys. But do you know who has twice as many followers on Twitter than Donald Trump?
Who?
Barack Obama.
What?
I mean, we have this idea that I thought that Trump must be blowing all of the other political people out of the water, but Barack Obama has twice as many. Now
What?
that I
When did that come from? What was the year that was
think
stated?
it was 2020 or something like that.
Because Trump's not on. Okay, 20. When did he get kicked off? When did Trump get kicked off of Twitter?
2020.
Okay.
But he's on now.
Is he?
I
Are
think
you
he's
sure?
back on. Yeah, I'm pretty sure.
I don't think he is, but I could be wrong. I don't. I'm not on Twitter.
We can look into that. But then the next thing, but either way, back when he was on, I mean, I was looking at numbers back when he was at his height, which was like 55 million or something like that. And Barack Obama was like 140 million followers. I mean, almost twice as many. So, like we talk about, like we compare him to Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren. By the way, it's funny that they didn't even put Joe Biden on here.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but so they
He must be
they
low.
they pick and choose who he's going up against. I mean, that's Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth. They didn't even win the Democratic nominations.
Well, I mean, they're just talking from if I recall correctly, they were just looking at general political pages, not cherry picking the political pages.
They said Trump led the pack among U.S. elected officials. They have Donald Trump,
Elected officials. Okay.
Then Bernie Sanders, then Elizabeth Warren, then Ted Cruz, then Elizabeth Warren again for some reason. Oh, her personal page is higher than her page as a senator, which is funny that they split them up because then she has 33 million, which is more. But anyway,
Okay.
uh, and then they've got Kevin McCarthy. I mean, they've got Kevin McCarthy on here. I don't know. But then to further cherry pick the data, then they say, well, Fox News, Breitbart, and Fox News and Breitbart outdistance mainstream media. So they don't even consider. It just gives you some idea of what these guys' thoughts are on the right and the left.
Well, let's go
If
back
they're
to
going
the
to
cherry.
say,
Let's go back to the cherry
okay,
picking statement because I don't
no,
think that they should.
I want to. I'm continuing that with the Fox News and Breitbart
Okay.
statement because I was just kind of bringing it up again. It's interesting that they don't consider them that because that tells you something about how they lean politically. These people that are putting this report together, at least it's an indication of something. But they list Fox News at 448 million interactions, Breitbart at 295 million, and then they list CNN, ABC News, BBC News, NBC News, NPR News, now this, New York Times, and show how much less each of them, how many fewer interactions those different organizations have.
Mm-hmm.
But there's only two conservative outlets there.
Mm-hmm.
If you add up all of those interactions, like you and I think it seems obvious to me that Fox News is the most, although Fox News is, they always talk about how they have the most viewers and everything, almost saying like, yeah, we have more viewers because people like what we're doing more. No, it's just there's not a lot of conservative options, right? I mean, the problem is CNN is competing against ABC, BBC, NBC, NPR, now this, New York Times. They're competing against all these other organizations. And if you say, well, all of the conservatives are going to a few different outlets, once you add up all the left leaning and all the right leaning outlets, it kind of balances out. So once again, they're kind of choosing, they're picking and choosing the data, and you can twist the data either intentionally or unintentionally. I don't think these are bad guys. So probably this is unintentional. But it makes it look worse when you say, well, look how much interactions the conservative news outlets, they're beating every single one. Well, because there's a lot of different left leaning outlets. So, yeah, twisting the data unintentionally, I presume, because these guys are probably good people. I honestly don't think they're being malicious. But yeah, things start to look a little bit different when you twist the data in that way.
You bring up a valid point. I do think that, I hadn't really thought about this fact, but there are less options for one to get the news if you are like right leaning, whereas if you're left leaning, you have a whole lot more choices to choose from. Now, of course, even in both categories, some of them are cable news, some of them are network news, some of them are internet, some of them are print. But when you look at the two right leaning options, you have internet and you have cable. And of course, both of those, really what we're talking about here is their presence on Facebook. So it's, social media being a little bit different than who you choose to follow. And maybe that's the point, is that on social media, it doesn't matter what your medium is, because on Facebook, the medium's the same. It's all social media. It's all on their website. So I will concede that point. It is a valid point. Now, when you look at, you brought up Barack Obama as, having more followers, but remember, he's not political at this point. He's out of the office. And from what I recall, from the few, I don't really follow him. As I said before, I don't follow social media, but from what I have seen or heard, he's not very involved politically. He's mostly involved in production, and he occasionally makes comments about things like the climate and some other, you could look social issues, if you will, but he's not very heavily involved in the political environment. So I think that may be why they don't include him in those some of the political pages. But also, you were talking about elected officials, and of course, 2020, he's not elected, so that's why he wouldn't be there.
I wasn't talking about elected officials.
No, but the list you went through was all elected officials. The Trump, Elizabeth Warren, Bernie Sanders, McCarthy, all those were as elected officials.
But it makes your data look better when you use elected officials and not Barack Obama.
Well, but
I mean, if you're saying, like, you're making the point, like, hey, look at this. I mean, how could it be that we are suppressing him on social media if he's winning?
Who?
That's essentially the argument that they're making in this, at this point in the paper. They're saying, how could Donald Trump be getting so much interactions on Facebook if they're suppressing him, right? Because he's got so many more interactions than Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, whatever else.
Mm-hmm.
Well, if you only use elected officials as opposed to using political figures, then yeah, he does look a lot better. But then you might see Barack Obama has a lot more.
But if he's not acting as a political figure, then there's no value in having that information there.
Yeah, there is, because it shows that he's not beating everybody. Why can't he? Maybe he'd be beating Barack Obama if they weren't suppressing him. Like, it's a bad argument to begin with to say, well, listen, he wouldn't have more interactions than them if we were suppressing his influence.
Barack Obama is not political at this point.
Yes, he is. He is a former president. He still is a political figure. I get it what you're saying. Like, you can't just say, well, he's no longer political because he's not in office anymore. No, he is. He is in the political sphere. That's where he came from. He still makes comments about Donald Trump. And sure, he may make other comments too, but he is still a political figure. These guys are still political figures, even when they get out of office. They still
if they're not making political statements, how can they be a political figure?
He's never made a political statement since he left office. That's not true. He's made comments about Donald Trump before, about how he disapproves of Donald Trump.
If what's the guy, the quarterback for Green Bay Packers? If he makes a political statement, is he now a political figure?
He's made a political statement.
If If he has,
I,
he's not a political
yes,
figure.
I would consider him less of a political statement than Barack Obama because he never was an elected official and he makes very few political statements. Barack Obama has made thousands of political statements and he was in office for more than a decade.
He
He
made
is a political figure.
he made political statements when he was in office. I mean, George W. Bush is. I don't would consider him a political figure anymore either.
Well, either way, like this is kind of taking away from the whole argument.
Sure,
We're
you're
kind
right.
of quibbling over this small point. My point is when you look at the data in a certain way, it makes it look worse than it is. And those I thought were two examples of them looking at it in very specific ways. There might even be other elected officials that have more influence. Maybe those are the elected officials that had the most interactions on Facebook. I don't know. But it does seem like and maybe, frankly, we're just talking about interactions here. Maybe Donald Trump had more interactions than even Barack Obama in that time frame.
Could be.
But he's very good at it. There's other reasons. It doesn't prove that there hasn't been bias in social media.
Well,
You know,
if there's bias against the conservative voices, shouldn't they be showing up lower on the lists?
no, not necessarily. Lower than they otherwise would have. I mean, I guess Brian, it's almost like you're saying, well, if there was any bias, then is the argument that you're making, I'm just trying to understand it, that if there was any bias in social media, then every Republican official would show up lower than the Democratic officials?
Well, okay, so the argument that's being put forth is that there's bias against conservatives. And if there is bias against conservatives, there should be some sort of evidence. And the most obvious evidence that I can think of is that, yes, they would show up lower than their liberal counterparts.
Um, well, yeah, that just doesn't make logical sense.
Why not?
They would show up because, for example, well, let's say you and I had a race and I was doing steroids and you won because you had trained harder. Does that prove that I wasn't doing steroids because I lost?
No.
Exactly.
But okay, so then what's your evidence that there's bias against conservatives?
All I'm attacking their methodology here. I'm saying that that is not a good argument. But it doesn't necessarily prove that there hasn't been bias. My evidence is that 92% of Facebook is left leaning, 96% of Google is left leaning, 97% of Twitter is left leaning. That we have examples of stories that were removed from social media, major news stories that were removed from social media, and those news stories are positive to the right side of the aisle. We don't have similar examples of stories that would benefit the left that were removed from social media.
Okay, so your evidence that there's bias is that there's a lot of people that are liberal in the companies, and that there has been individual particular stories that have been not given the same exposure as other stories. That's your evidence that there's bias.
And a Gizmodo report from 2016 that two contract employees gave evidence that the trending topics team had routinely removed articles from right-wing sources.
Did they say anything about the removing of stories on the left-wing sources?
Nope.
So therefore, it didn't happen?
I'm saying you asked for my evidence, Brian. You asked my evidence of right-leaning, not my evidence of left-leaning. I'm giving you the evidence of the right-leaning bias.
Okay, so if we talk about the population of the companies that are liberal, your belief is that because they are liberal, therefore the companies must be biased.
No, I'm saying that's evidence that something could be happening.
Could be.
It's not conclusive. Yes, 100%. I'm not saying that means 100% or proves my point. Not at all.
Okay.
I'm not saying
So
that at all. And I would say something else, Brian, just to like you made a point the other day on that discussion that we had that I think we should address to some extent. We are talking here, let's talk about three types of organizations. Let's talk about normal businesses, the news media, and social media. So normal businesses would be, for example, let's say there's a restaurant and you made I can't remember if you said a gas station or a restaurant, there's certain norms or that are expected. There's certain rules when you go into this place. So if you, for example, go to a gas station and you start spouting off about Trump won the election or we shouldn't be in Ukraine or whatever, the manager's probably going to ask you to leave. If you're harassing, if you're talking to all the customers that come in, it's not the forum for it. You shouldn't be doing those types of things. So he's going to say, hey, you can leave. You can't come in here if you're going to be talking about that stuff.
Right.
However, then we go to news organizations where those things are discussed, but not in the same way. It's not like I can go into the New York Times and start yelling at people, or I can, even write a news story for the New York Times. I don't work there, but they do discuss those types of things. And they are supposed to be looking at news stories and presenting them to the world in an unbiased fashion. Then we have social media, which is different than the news media. And social media, as I understand it, is a forum or a place where people can come and share their opinions about their families, sometimes about their vacations, about politics, about a lot of different things. And that is the place where what we are talking about today, where, in my opinion, and I don't think we should litigate this, I don't think we should force it. They can do whatever they want. Frankly, if they want to shadow ban the right, if they want to suppress right leaning stories, or however you want to put it, if they want to kick Donald Trump off, rightly or wrongly, anybody they want to kick off, they can. I get that. And I would never propose government regulations or laws enforcing that they would have to open that up to everybody or let Trump back on or kick him off or anything. I think they should be able to make those decisions themselves. All I'm talking about today is what I think they should do, because purportedly their purpose is to offer that up to people, a forum where we can go and express our opinions. And in this case, you and I are talking about political opinions. I think that is important, that they should offer that up to everybody equally. I think there's a real danger that they're not doing that. Can I prove it? I can't. I think it's a difficult thing to prove either direction. I think it's a little bit suspicious when so many employees are from one political party. I think that's really suspicious. Does it prove my point? No. I think there's some evidence that some things have happened in the past. I don't think there was good reasons to remove the Hunter Biden story uh, from Twitter and from Facebook, or suppress it on Facebook like they did. I don't think that was the correct thing. Would I sue them for it? No, because I think they're within their rights to do it. But I don't think they should have done it. And I think that that is further evidence. And not to say that, like I think that means Joe Biden shouldn't have been elected. Like, all that is aside, I just think when a news organization like the New York Post brings that story forward and tries to present it to people and you suppress it, I think that is evidence to me that they are, and I agree, it's not comprehensive evidence. It wouldn't hold up in a court of law, but I think it is further evidence that they are leaning one direction. They have a tendency, it seems, from what I can gather, and I don't have hard evidence in either direction, but I do see more evidence that they seem to suppress and shadow ban, or whatever you want to call it. They have a left-leaning bias, and they tend to fight against the right a little bit more. It's
Well,
within their rights to do it. I don't think they should do it.
let's also remember that when Mark Zuckerberg had said, and this is by your admission, because I don't have I didn't have received the interview, but Mark Zuckerberg said that when he pushed down or suppressed the Hunter Biden story, it was at the suggestion of the FBI. So we have a company that's acting at the suggestion of the FBI. And it's not too often that someone's going to say, yeah, you government people, yeah, you don't know what you're talking about. I've got the First Amendment I need to go and stand by. So it's not just them acting unilaterally or acting to promote their left leaning views. The FBI suggested that it was that they might consider doing it. And so,
No, that's not quite what happened.
okay.
It is almost what happened. But just before we move on from that, what I believe happened was they came to him shortly before the story came out and said, by the way, you may see some Russian disinformation in the future. Be aware of that. They looked at this story and decided that it was the Russian disinformation. So, and they decided to suppress it for a while. Now, I'll say two things about that. One, there's some question about whether the FBI should be doing that. And two, some people would say, well, that was further weaponization of the government against Donald Trump. That was inappropriate. I'm not saying that's the case. I'm just saying, like, there's some
I,
question about whether they should have done that or not. And two, that it wasn't like the FBI said it's the Hunter Biden laptop story. That's probably disinformation, which I'm glad. I hope they didn't say that. I never heard that they did, but I hope they didn't say that because it was Hunter Biden's laptop and it wasn't Russian disinformation. Like what we should look at that, Brian, and say, you know what? That should be a cautionary tale, I think, because it turns out that the story was pretty accurate.
as far as we know. Now we're not getting into the
About two
conversation about
years.
Hunter Biden. We're not getting into the conversation about Hunter Biden laptop because we got 2 minutes left. And so the last thing that I want to say about social media bias, and I can link to this particular scientific article, was that experiments involving Twitter users show that political right enjoy higher amplification compared to the political left. Some findings point at the possibility that strong partisan bias in news reporting is associated with higher amplification. That amplification comes from two sources, from internal algorithms and from external shares and likes. And so, again, it does point to the lack of a bias against a conservative media. Anything you want to follow up with? Got a minute and a half.
Not very conclusive. That's not very conclusive evidence. But yeah, I guess what I would say is, when we were talking about this stuff, we were talking about the sensationalism and how that gets you likes and gets you. It almost felt like we were saying, well, listen, if you want to get likes, you have to be histrionical, or you have to, be like Trump, be kind of over the top. But when I looked at the people who have the most followers on Twitter, it's Barack Obama, and then it's like Katy Perry and people that aren't even getting into this stuff. They get the most likes. They're the ones. It's Katy Perry, Justin Bieber, people like that are really the most popular. So
I think Christian Ronaldo has one of the highest followed pages on Twitter, I think.
Yeah, I don't know. So I don't think it's all like, hey, you have to say crazy things like Trump in order to get these likes, or be right-wing conspiracy theory to get likes. There's plenty of people that are doing it in different ways and are just feel-good people that, I don't know. It seems like Katy Perry is more of a feel-good, Justin Bieber more feel-good than political statements, but I could be wrong.
I'd say so. I'm with you on that one. On that, we agree.
Okay.
All right, so we're at the end of our time, and I'm going to put some links on the website to some of the different articles that we have referenced, some of the different studies, so that people can follow up on their own as well if they have an interest. Thank you for a little more exciting conversation than we've had of recent days. We hope you learned something in this episode of Brother versus Brother, a podcast about difficult conversations. We also hope that you enjoyed it enough to subscribe to the podcast. You can help us by spreading the word. Share this episode on your favorite social media so that others will have an opportunity to experience it as well. You can also support us by donating through Patreon. This information and more can be found on our website, broconvo.com, and on our various social media accounts. Thank you.